You know what, Gary? That's the smoothest introduction we've done as well.
There you go. Coming from a technophobe. I'll see if I can. I'll just see if I can perch this on my laptop. Right.
We all set up?
Yeah, it's all right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
All right. Yeah, I can hear you. We're all good. We're all sort of, I think everyone's coming in. We've got a good audience in there as well.
Hi everybody.
So I think what we've done, we'll see everything we get coming through in the meantime, and then obviously we've had loads of questions and stuff come through. So I think we'll just see how it goes, and we'll just flow it as organically as possible. And I think, well, I was trying to think, but I think we best really should start with just how everything is. How are you doing in general?
Yeah, it's challenging time, isn't it, for everybody at the moment. And I'm currently in Darwin near Blackburn. I've not seen my son for a month. Come up here, and I've got elderly parents who live up here. So my mum's bipolar, and my dad's 86-year-old, and he's trying to look after my mum. So I've come up to support them really and shop for them. And so I go and drop their shopping on the doorstep, and I'm staying with my girlfriend. My girlfriend's she's an NHS midwife. She's been a nurse for 30 years, a midwife for 25 years. So she's on the front line, comes home and tells me what's going on, dispels all the myths that you see in the news. So I'm just trying to keep my life simple at the moment, stay in a bubble, not looking at the news, not spending too much time on social media, trying to live within 24 hours, get up. Am I healthy? Is everybody else healthy? Have we got food in the cupboard? Have I got a few quid in the bank to get through today? If that's the case, run through till bedtime tonight, and tomorrow we go again, I know this kind of, how long is it going to last? What's going to happen on the other side? I just deal with that when it arrives,
Yeah, I think one thing for me is, as much as everything's going on, I think we've seen a lot of people come together, and I think when we do eventually get out of it, and we will get out of it, I think we'll all come out of it a lot stronger and a lot more united, so we just need to take the positives from it and look after each other, and we'll be there.
Yeah, I mean, the range I designed, Special, it was, I just didn't feel comfortable kind of, talking about new trainers right now. I know I've seen all kinds of rumours and leaks all over the place, but it's just, it gets leaked pretty much every season anyway, but this season's kind of an exceptional one. And, I just didn't feel comfortable trying to sort of going on about the latest trainer when, there's people losing the jobs left, right and centre.
Yeah, totally.
To just hold off on it. And so we've just had to push it back, and there's still a few things that are up in the air with that at the moment.
Yeah, but again, it gives a bit of light relief and something to look forward to and all this as well. So I think there's, with everything, there's priorities in there, like you say. So there's a lot more important things going on right now, but there's something to look forward to at the end of it all as well.
Absolutely. Just got to kind of hope there's a bounce, but it's just like how we go from this to kind of being in a football stadium full of people. It just seems like, how do you get from A to B? But
I know.
Like I say, we will.
So I think out of all the questions we've had, of all the bits we've got through and coming through at the bottom, I think there's probably the place to start, really. Obviously, it's 2020. We're celebrating 20 years of size. I think you've been part of that journey. You probably remember it more than a lot of people in terms of it coming to the market. What was your sort of first memories of size, or your first sort of interactions with the brand?
Well, I joined Adidas in the late 90s, and I met a guy who was the buyer for JD Sports at the time, a guy called Paul Fox. And him and a guy called Barry Bound, who I think was the retail director, were looking at doing a concept called JDFC, which was, I think, JD Footwear Concept, which was, I think, if I remember rightly, that was kind of the precursor to what became size. So I know that Barry in the 90s had done a store in Manchester called Athleisure, where they used to sell a few interesting bits and pieces like Kegler Supers and stuff like that. And so they were looking at doing this thing, but I think the thing with JD was they wanted the JD name to be in the name of it. And then I think they had a lot of battles to finally come up with this idea of size. But what happened with size was I was working on a thing called entertainment promotions for Adidas at that time. So it was my job to work, to be the arbiter of the relationships between Adidas and the entertainment industry. There wasn't an originals division. You know, there was no Y3. There was none of, like, you know, this idea of like sportswear as lifestyle and fashion. You just never really, you know, that was kind of almost unimaginable then. I remember the head of Adidas at a global marketing meeting in 1999 kind of banging his fist and saying, you know, this is not a fashion brand. And so it was a very different kind of landscape then, a very different retail landscape. And what I used to do was, you know, I would, because when I first got that job in entertainment promotions, because it was such a kind of sports-based company at the time, so kind of pure sport, it was almost seen as a bit of a comedy role, really. And the people who'd done it prior to me hadn't done it particularly well. And so I kind of had to make that understandable to people who share very, you know, who don't share the same reference points as me. And one of the things I used to do was that when musicians or actors or artists came into the office and they got shoes, I'd take Polaroids of them. And I had this big board in the Adidas office that was covered in Polaroids of different people, and they'd sign the Polaroid. So there was everybody up there from, you know, from Joe Strummer to Shawn Ryder. You know, it was like a whole gamut of different people. And Paul Fox came into the Adidas office one day and he saw the Polaroids and he said, I'm nicking that idea. I said, you what? He said, I'm nicking that idea. He said, but we're going to do it for consumers. He said, we're setting up this new, retail idea. And it didn't have a name at that point. And then he came up with size. And it started in Carnaby Street. And I remember around that time as well, a good friend of mine was running a store for Levi's in Newburgh Street called Finch, which is there to this day. And they specialised in sort of vintage Levi's. But what they also did was to contextualise the denim stuff they were doing. They put, like, you know, old vinyl in there, vintage denim in there, and they put vintage trainers in there. And so this friend of mine spoke to me about it, and we had this kind of verbal agreement, which was that we would only put Adidas shoes in there, and that I would help her to find these Adidas shoes.
Okay.
So Paul saw that and kind of took that idea and put that into size. So sometimes in the early days of size, this was before you guys were making your own shoes and doing your own exclusive shoes. You know, there would be like random pairs of vintage shoes in glass boxes in size, you know, and so I saw it's, you know, at its very birth, and then I watched it slowly evolve, and then, you know, the branch opened in Covent Garden, and we used to work quite closely with those and do little exhibitions in there in the basement, and sometimes I'd get shoes out of my personal collection and loan them to them. So, you know, at the time when size came out, the whole landscape of the industry was completely different, and size was a big contributing factor in changing that landscape. So, you know, there was no, you know, there were no forums, there were no hype sites, you know, there was no kind of hype beast or high snobiety, there was no resellers, there was no, you know, only a handful of books about trainers, you know, like by Neil Hurd. The only place you get magazines about trainers was in Japan. It was, you know, it was very, very different. Like I said, there was no Adidas Originals division at the time. So these were very formative years, and much of what happened in those years, you know, they were quite pioneering years. You only realise in hindsight just how influential those years were, because in many ways they set they created the landscape that we have now, you know.
Yeah. But I think it's crazy to think even sort of like 10 years ago, we didn't have Instagram. Like, and as much as you were saying Polaroid photos there 20 years ago, I guess that is Instagram of today, essentially. And obviously it's almost whatever comes now, you have to evolve with it, embrace it and go with it. And ultimately in 10 years time, we'll be saying it something completely different, and how it keeps evolving. And that's the the beauty of it, I think. 'Cause as everything evolves, these are just platforms to connect more people. I think that's a big way this industry's grown, because people have become more connected through the likes of social media and through all these different things. So, like you say, forums, probably probably early 2000s, mid 2000s. That's when the likes of Crooked Tongues and these things did become a bit more influential as well, isn't it?
Well, the first thing that Crooked Tongues worked on with Adidas was the Superstar 35th anniversary. You know, I was quite skeptical of working with the guys from Crooked Tongues because, you know, they were always a kind of a multi-brand kind of organisation. There were people like Chris Law who worked inside Crooked Tongues who were very Adidas, but then there were other people who were connected to Crooked Tongues who were very Nike, you know. And
Yeah.
and my kind of thing was, maybe it's that thing of being a northerner in London. I was kind of like, they were all guilty until proven innocent for me. You know, it was like I wanted to be aligned with, you know, it was always my thing to align with where there was a synergy to Adidas. I
Yeah.
was not about trying to convince people who weren't into Adidas to become Adidas lovers, because it wasn't about that really.
No.
But yeah, I met them in the early 2000s, and they were one of the first kind of collectives in the UK. You know, they did the Crooked Tongues Forum, which, you know, I never used to go on it, but they had that forum, and then they used to do a magazine called Dead Stock, which was like a kind of a fanzine type thing. But you know, a lot of this stuff seems so almost naive now to how sophisticated everything's become. But you know, some of the things I like about that era were that, you know, it feels like nowadays, a lot of the time, the value of products is measured purely commercially.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, what's its resale value on StockX or whatever? And it's kind of like, for me, there's value in wearing products and interacting with products. You know, the thing of wearing and interacting with it means that you get memories from it. You know,
Totally.
it becomes intrinsic to the fabric of your life. It becomes intrinsic to your experiences, rather than just being, you know, like a kind of an exercise in who's got the most money. Do you know what I mean? That to me, it was never about that really. It was always, when I was growing up, it was always about finding that pair of trainers that other people didn't have, not in that must-have pair of trainers that everybody's hyped up about. And you said something really interesting earlier today that really made me think, and no one said it to me before, and that was you were talking about hype releases and how they look old very quickly nowadays. You know what I mean? They become dated quite quickly, and how, you know, the stuff that, you know, I like to think a lot of the stuff that I work on, I'm quite proud of a lot of the stuff I've worked on, projects I've worked on. And I can look at some of those things and think, well, you know, they still stand up.
Totally.
Stand up. You know, the first Bathing Ape collaboration, it still stands up. The Y3 Hacienda collaboration, it still stands up. The Adidas Manchesters, they still stand up. Do you know
but arguably that Bathing Ape piece is probably one of the most influential pieces gone on to inform all this other stuff's been built off the back of that, because until something like that happened, it almost pioneered that way of looking at things as well. Whether you can pinpoint a moment or not, but there's not many things that happened before that, and obviously it changed the mindset completely.
Well, what's interesting about that is that there was no department inside Adidas that was set up to do collaborations. You know, and Bathing Ape was such a closed shop. You know, I would go over every year to either Fuji Rock Festival or Summer Sonic Festival in Japan, because I worked on entertainment for Adidas. So when I would go over there, like the Fuji Rock Festival, all the dressing rooms, it was all in, all the artists would stay inside what was a ski lodge in winter. So all the dressing rooms were on one corridor. So I would go over there, you know, first time I went over there, the Happy Mondays took me over there with them. But, you know, you're in the dressing room, so you just go from dressing room to dressing room and meet people. And, you know, that's how I would kind of be building relationships. So I was going over to Japan at that time. And then I was over there with Ian Brown, who introduced me to Kazuki, because Ian was part of the original streetwear fraternity, you know, like Bathing Ape in the late 90s. It was like a clique of people, and it was, you know, it was James Lavelle, it was Ian Brown, it was, you know, Fraser Cook, Michael Koppelman, you know, a lot of that original Stussy tribe, you know. And so when I was going over there, I was going to see the people at Adidas Japan, but they had no connection to Bathing Ape. And I was sending football kits over for the Bathing Ape football team. So I built a genuine rapport and relationship with Kazuki, and we built a friendship. And then when you know, we were saying, wouldn't it be fun to do something together?
Yeah, totally.
And when I put that to Adidas were like, well, we're not really set up to do this, but it's the right thing to do. So let's find a way to make it happen. Like you say, because, you know, it wasn't like nowadays where you've got, you know, consortium and statements and all this stuff that's set up for collaboration. Collaboration was, you know, no sportswear brand had collaborated with a streetwear brand in such an overt way before.
And I think that's the epitome of ultimate collaboration. It's not putting a logo on something or anything like that. It's like you've said there, you've broken a relationship, you've brought people together, and you've almost clashed two ideas that, even though they're completely different ways of thinking, they're aligned in terms of what their DNA is of brands. So I think there's not many things, if you had a timeline or a trajectory of how everything's worked. Arguably, that's one of the moments that sparked this world this whole industry that we're in, essentially, in terms of what people are doing now. One you touched on was obviously Manchester, and obviously Manchester's one that all these comments below are getting Manchester as well. I don't know is it worth touching on the whole sort of thought process of what started in Manchester, because arguably Manchester's a big city in terms of that following and that sort of community as well.
Yeah, well, what's funny about that is that there was a guy called Jay Nowback who works on Adidas Originals footwear back then, and he somehow ended up based in the office in London with us. And City Series shoes, I mean, anyone that was around in the 80s will know that City Series shoes, anyone that kind of, you know, came up through that whole thing, be, you know, electro, football casuals, acid house, that kind of era, you know, my generation essentially, you know, City Series weren't a big thing. It's become like the defining shoes of football casuals nowadays, it seems. But in the 80s, it was, you know, it was kind of cross-divisional. It jumped around. It was court shoes. It was ZX running shoes, you know. Prior to ZX, it was TRX. It was, you know, the ultimate shoe when I was growing up was the Adidas Grand Slam. That was like the absolute holy grail of Adidas trainers, you know. And anything with the sort of suspension plugs, you know, LA Trainer, and you know, I had Adidas SRS, you know. But City shoes were like this kind of niche thing, and it was very, for me, you know, I mean, I remember it being a very Manchester thing. There was a shop called Oasis in Manchester, which was a couple of Manchester City fans who were parallel importing products from the continent. And in many ways, Oasis was, it was like the blueprint for what became, you know, what Oi Polloi have done in the last however many, you know, years. That was kind of almost a blueprint. It was like Manchester street fashion. And that was the only place I really remember seeing any City shoes. There was flat suede stuff around. A lot of people wore, you know, Gazelles, but there were only 3 colorways of Gazelles. And then there were flat suede shoes like Madeira and Samoa. But there were, you know, it's like City shoes weren't a big thing. They weren't a big thing. Mike Shakuti, who works with me, he's a Mancunian, he's from Failsworth. He had Adidas Berlin, he had Adidas Dublin when he was a kid, you know. But like, the only City shoes I really remember in Blackburn when I was growing up was Stockholm and Stockholm GT. You know, a lot of the City series, you know, you just never saw those shoes.
No.
I never physically saw a pair of Adidas Brussels in the 1980s. And believe me, I saw a lot of Adidas trainers, but I never physically saw a pair. So when it came to the Adidas Manchester, Jay Nowback was working in our office. The Commonwealth Games were coming up in Manchester, and Adidas had tried to reissue a couple of City Series shoes, but they were the specifications on the shoes, the toe boxes. It was like, I remember saying to the developer, you know, those toe boxes aren't right. And he was saying, he was an American guy, and he's going, yeah, but the colours are right. And I'm going, there's more to it than the colours, mate. There's a lot more to it than that, you know. And so the Manchester, I put this idea forward to Jay. I said, why don't we do a limited edition shoe that's based on the City Series? Because the City Series, you know, I remember it being a real Mancunian thing. There's never been a shoe dedicated to Manchester. Let's just do a few hundred pairs of them. And he said, but me being a marketer, you know, I was working in marketing. I was not the product guy, so I didn't understand about how long it was going to take to make those. And he said, Gary, you know, we're not going to have the time to sample these. You need to use an existing silhouette. And so I suggested using the silhouette of the handball special because it was, you know, not massively dissimilar to the handball specials in the 80s. And don't get me wrong, I know there's been lots of different versions of handball. Sorry, 1 second, people keep sending texts. There's been lots of different versions of handballs, but I thought that would work. And me and Mike Shakuti, I think it took us about 20 minutes on a Friday afternoon in the office where we had a colour wheel and we said, right, you know, red for United, blue for City, put it together. And it was very ad hoc. And Jay, there was no sample. It was almost like, you know, there was one prototype pair and they went straight into stores.
Yeah.
The funny thing about it is, Luke, they didn't sell.
Which is mad to think of it now.
There's only a few hundred pairs. I think it might have been, you know, it was literally a few hundred pairs. They didn't sell out. They were sat there. And it was like, and then the Commonwealth Games came and the Commonwealth Games went. And then as time went on, they became more coveted as time went on and more desirable. And it was almost like we replanted this seed of City Series. And then, you know, 9 years later, you have the size 10th anniversary where Paul Fox and Paul Ruffles kind of put this idea together, which was essentially the formula of the original Adidas Manchester, but using it across key cities right across the UK, which is what you guys have followed up on now with the 20th anniversary. But, you know, I think what size did in 2010 really cemented something that had just been a fledgling idea in 2001, 2002.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think that. I think because now, if anything, it's almost the mainstay, the grail status in amongst all of it. But like you say, there's been, over the years, been so many other models in there that's not necessarily been forgotten about, but they play second fiddle now to this tier where it's almost that's seen at the top. And I think over the last few years, we've seen more cities than we've ever seen in terms of that rollout. So, and I think the other thing that's been interesting, that there's been so many different iterations now of each city. I mean, Vienna, there's been about 8 different versions across the board when it used to be licensed out in different factories. And and you'll get exactly the same. We get said so many times about toolings, and we could talk for days on toolings, but a lot of times when we get certain questions and stuff, it's sometimes not as easy as just bringing a shoe back, is it?
No, it's certainly not as easy as just bringing the shoe back. I think, you know, a lot of people out there imagines that I kind of, you know, with Special, that I've got access to every kind of shoe in the archive and every catalogue, and I just sit there and scratch my chin and kind of go, oh, I'll take that one, and I'll take that one, and
I wish we could.
And it's like, there's so much more to it than that. You know, it's kind of like, you know, like I saw one of the questions somebody had put online was about, you know, what shoe from the archive would I like to work on? Well, yeah. ZX600 was one.
Yeah, add us onto the list.
That was reissued previously. The tooling's not there anymore.
No.
And I'm giving a little trade secret away there, but this, you know, this season in Special, there's a shoe coming called the Ashurst. God bless Jack McLaughlin. And that shoe was, you know, came about because I wanted to do a ZX600. I'd wanted to do a ZX600 a couple of seasons back. We got round to going back to it. The factory didn't have the molds for the toolings anymore.
Yeah.
So we can't do a ZX600 now. And ZX600 is one of my favourite shoes of all time. But I also out of that has come the Ashurst, and I love the Ashurst. I think it's a fantastic running shoe. So,
well, interestingly, one of the first sort of proper cues I remember ever seeing at size, and it was whenever it last came out, it was about 2006, 2007, was ZX600. And I think that was the first time as a consumer seeing people physically queuing in big numbers for essentially just what was a ZX600. That was it. There was to the outside world, there was nothing special about that shoe other than it being obviously what we all see is something super special, because we obviously know how it is. And I mean, yeah, the Ashurst is as close as we're going to get.
People are always asking me for, when we're going to do the Silver Wind. Well, when am I going to get the tooling for it? because creating the tooling costs so much money to do, that if you're going to create a tooling, then you've got to be able to balance the books of making enough shoes to pay off for those toolings. So,
well, this is why all those factories all those years ago got rid of the molds and made something else. They used it, they melted them down and made something else. That's why a lot of them don't exist. That's why Vienna from 2 years ago was on essentially on a ROM tooling, because the Vienna from 25 years ago physically doesn't exist.
Yeah, also because a lot of the shoes back then were made under license, and once the licenses were revoked, those factories went, well, we don't need these molds anymore.
Yeah, so, totally.
All those different.
Oh, we've lost Gary. Let me try and get him back in. Where it's just I had to fill the gap.
It's all right. I needed to stop to take a breath anyway.
Oh, okay, good. Well, where was I think one thing that's interesting. I don't know if you had any questions on it, but I think it's definitely a really interesting one. Is for me, obviously, how the community's evolved, and I think from an influence perspective, how do you see the different generations and the different generations' influences? Do you feel it's dads influencing sons, or do you feel it's subcultures influencing people? What are the sort of reference points and touch points?
It's really hard to say. I mean, it depends which part of it we're talking about. We've touched on a few things already. One hand we're talking about bathing ape collaboration and streetwear, and then we're talking about Adidas Manchester. And there's people who will appreciate both those things. But I think, this idea of the sneakerhead and sneaker culture, it's not as all encompassing as, like for me, the word sneakerhead or the word sneaker culture is a derivative of something that's American.
Yeah.
What we have in the UK is a culture that revolves around, athletic footwear and sportswear, but it's kind of our own culture.
Yeah.
And yeah,
totally.
There's kids like me who came up where, with Sergio Tacchini and Fila and all that sort of stuff, and European sportswear brands who were appropriating what was an American look with, in the early days of hip hop.
Yeah.
But you've got that British casual thing that, if you look at British hip hop, some of the main players in British hip hop, whether that's DJ Milo from Bristol or Goldie from Wolverhampton, we're football fans. Do you know what I mean? And so there's a very UK-centric subculture that follows a lot of what I work on, and also shops with size. Do you know what I mean? And
yeah, totally. And
we've talked about this before. It's not something that necessarily crosses over globally. So it's something that's very much about the UK and Northern Europe. There's little pockets of it in other places without question, but it's those people are not sneakerheads.
No.
They're not people, their motivations and their mindset is very different to that of your hyped up reseller type market. It's two quite different things, and things that are acceptable to a hyped up reseller type market are real kind of absolute no-nos with the kid, the people that are into the stuff that I work on and the stuff that you guys work on too.
Totally, and I think, I mean, we've spoke about it before, but I think there's almost a generational gap of their reference point in terms of, like, you'd say you'll watch a certain film and you almost see that as a style element as well. That's like the ultimate influence. And I think you've touched on it. It's in what film influenced you in terms of that touch point into the world.
Well, the way I see it is that, I mean, I go to football, and the ultimate compliment for the work I do is when I see people at football who don't, just wearing the stuff. That for me is what it's all about. That lad who goes out and he's got a pair of trainers on, his mate goes, "Hey, what are them? Where did you get them from?" That to me is the essence of what it's all about. But I remember seeing Quadrophenia for the first time and thinking, wow, I'd love to have been a modern 60s. And I think there's kids now who are 18 years old who are watching, The Firm or Away Days or whatever, going, wow, I'd love to have been a casual in the 80s, and they hear stories from their dads or their uncles or whatever. And there's because I used to say to Adidas, I'd say to product managers, "Oh, come on, let's reissue Indoor Super, do us like before I worked on products."
Yeah.
And they'd be like, "What, for you and your mates? You and your mates are all getting older now, But what's happened is me and my mates have got older, but then our kids have grown up, and there's new generations of it, and it's like, and this thing is something that it remains constant. It's not something it's not a trend. It's not something that it's a subculture. It's not music led, and it's not easily understood by those who sit on the outside of it. And people who are into that, who come up through that, they can kind of spot the cracks a mile off. They can spot
totally. I think we've spoke about it before, though, Gary. It's trends do come and go, and subcultures like this has almost been one ever present, especially for size that I can think of the last 20 years. Certain products come and it's almost that's what's big, that's what everyone wants. The next month it's something else, or next year it's something else. But this subculture is one that, if anything, has just grown and grown and grown over time. And you said that in 2002 the Manchester didn't sell out. Well, you can see obviously what both of the projects that we're all doing now do. It's if anything, it's grown and grown. So it's the only one that sort of has always been there for size and grown with size. I think that's why it's such a special part of, when you look back on all the projects we've done as a business and a brand, they're arguably the most iconic, because you can see that they've been put up by real connoisseurs that appreciate the detail, that appreciate all the things got into it. And that's ultimately what makes you proud to work on those projects.
Yeah, and you can see the milestones, really. You can see, 2010, that 10th anniversary of size, how important that was. You can see, like Spezial, when Spezial first launched. I mean, that's a funny one, because I've seen a lot of messages, since we did the Blackburn exhibition. I think some of the questions were, when are you going to bring the Spezial exhibition down south? So, well, we did
the first
down
one
south in 2013. We did it in London, do you know what I mean? And that in a way was to kind of introduce people to the idea of Spezial, because and it was kind of for us, by us, and then you go fast forward to 2014, and you have the first Spezial product range, and we launched it in Manchester. And then, and it was years before we got another exhibition off the ground. But I think, one thing those exhibitions have been kind of milestones, because what those exhibitions do, a bit like what you guys do when you launch your exclusive shoes, it's a communal thing. It brings people together.
Totally.
And that's really important. You know what I mean? Like the amount of people that came to Blackburn, to that exhibition, do you know what I mean? And what that did in Blackburn on so many different levels, do you know what I mean? We have, like, what it did for the community, the excitement it injected into the town. It was, for me, it was a career highlight. I've done all kinds of stuff all the world and all the rest
completely.
of it. To bring that back home, and to actually, because it's no mean feat. It was no mean feat convincing Adidas to get on board with that. When you go to Adidas and say, well, we want we want to do an Adidas exhibition in Blackburn. It's like, why would you want to do anything in Blackburn when it's one of the, it's one of the top 10 poorest towns in Europe? Why would you why would you want to go? And it's like, well, that's exactly why we should do this. And luckily, there's a few like-minded souls inside Adidas who shared that kind of vision, because it's very difficult to do things that are visionary inside big companies, because if you've got to get the sign off of 6 people to make it happen, then just by virtue of the fact that it's never been done before, it's like, well, they want to see something that's proven to work already a lot of the time. But like, fortunately, I mean, I've been with Adidas over 21 years, so I've built a lot of trust there, and I've got a good track record. And so there's there's other like-minded individuals who work inside the company, and it was like, okay, let's see what happens here. And interestingly, the Blackburn exhibition got a far bigger response than London, Manchester, Paris, Moscow, any of them. Now, I don't know if that's to do with the fact it captured people's imaginations putting it in a smaller town like that, or if I'm not going to say you just sent me a text message, but it's made me smile. Or it's the fact that this subculture that I've grown up with is a growing thing.
Totally. And I think what is, like, for me, that makes it really special is when you see groups of friends and people that literally have met at the exhibition or met in the queue, and they've then gone on to become proper friends, and that community, and it's a real community, it's gone on to facilitate real things. And I think that's the ultimate show of it. There's so many people within this scene and this subculture that have met through trainers and then have gone on to just be friends. And I think that's where shoes become more than just shoes. It is just more than shoes at that point, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's, and the thing about it is people are passionate about it. And I kind of accept that, because one thing that happens to me with my job, right, I put my head above the parapet. I'm not the kind of, when them products come out, if people aren't happy about it, it's me that's got to put my name to it.
Yeah, totally.
And it's me that's got to have broad enough shoulders to take the kind of flack that I get sometimes from people about about whatever it might be that they're not happy about. Do you know what I mean? It's like it comes at me directly, and that's the kind. But I have enough confidence in relation to what I do that I stand by what I do. I'm proud of what I do, and sometimes if there's something that's coming out and it's not how I want it to be, then I can get very frustrated about that, because it's like, yes, it's Adidas, and yes, it's Adidas Special, but ultimately people know that it's me that's curated that stuff. Do you know what I mean? And I do the very best I can with the resource that I've got available. A lot of the people that stand on the sidelines, unfortunately, have never made shoes. It's easy to criticise it when you've never had to do it yourself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
It's a bit like people that criticise musicians who've never played the guitar and never put themselves on offer like that.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I think one thing that we got a lot of questions on, and for me, it's probably one of the most iconic or memorable moments of the full Special piece, is Carlos and your relationship with Carlos and the many stories that is in there. I guess for everyone that's not aware, do you have a quick overview of how that came about, or how you found that place in Argentina?
Well, that came about through a guy who used to work with me called Tom Ramsden. And this is another size connection for you, because Tom Ramsden works in size.
Okay.
All kinds of people have worked in size.
I know.
Rita Ora used to work in size as well, and in Notting Hill once upon a time. But Tom Ramsden worked in size, and what used to happen was when some of the musicians used to come over from the States, I didn't have a big stock room, and sometimes I had to get products at short notice, and I couldn't order it from the warehouse. Well, this fellow used to run round to size with me company credit card, and this lad that used to serve me called Tom Ramsden, and he was dead polite, and he was a good kid, and he said to me, if there's ever a break to get into Adidas and work with you, let me know. and he was my first intern at Adidas, and then he went on to do all kinds of great stuff inside Adidas. You know, later on, you know, he became like the head of Adidas Originals and communications. The TV ad, the house party ad that they did.
Oh yeah.
Ago, he was the guy that was behind that.
Okay.
But Tom ended up going working for Adidas football, and he was in Argentina because Adidas sponsored the Argentinian football team. So he was down in Buenos Aires, and he stumbles upon that shop.
Which is mad.
So he sends me photos and goes, if there's anyone in Adidas that's going to love this, it's you, right? So he sends me photos. I remember the photos coming in. I'm sat in front of my computer, and I'm having like palpitations, you know what I mean? Going,
I bet.
How can I get to Buenos Aires? You know, it's like, and I tried to get to Buenos Aires back in around 2000, 2001 it was. One of the bands that I work with invited me. They said, you can come on, like, we're doing a world tour, wherever you want to come, we'll fly you down there. And I said, I want to come to Buenos Aires because I knew there was, Adidas was still being made under license there at that point. And then what had happened was Adidas, the economy crashed, and Adidas, the licensee went bankrupt. And that license went back to Adidas in Germany. So anyway, so I see this shop with all these old blue boxes in it, and I'm having the palpitations, and I'm thinking, there's no way I'm going to be able to get to Buenos Aires in time before someone stumbles upon that and figures it out. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, again, much to and fro inside Adidas, finally convinced them to finance us to go down there, because the whole thing about finding dead stock holes like that, it's kind of a dying art, really. And I thought it needed to be documented in some way.
Totally.
Now that this kind of trainer thing is as big as it is now, you want to have something there that you can look back on and say, yeah, that was what was happening in the 90s. Because, you know, when I was at college, I used to pick up dead stock shoes and sell them on to try and get a few extra quid together to get me through college. You know, my dad didn't have the money to put me through college, so you know, there was always that kind of bit of hustle going on to get a few quid extra. And so anyway, so it was like we need to document this. And so it was Robert Brooks, who's an hardcore Adidas fan, me and Mikey, and then I thought I'd ask Ian Brown to come down there with us, because I know that Ian loves seeing the world. And I said, when I rang Ian to invite him down there, I said, look, you know, you'll get a kind of a week away from any misery. You won't have people with camera phones in your faces. Like, because, you know, when we go out anywhere in the UK, it always happens. Somebody comes up and asks him for a picture. He gives one picture, and then within a minute, there's like a queue of them around him. Do you know what I mean? And he's good that way. Do you know what I mean? But sometimes it's a bit much. I said, look, you know, have a week away. And you know, we'll have a giggle. We're going to this Adidas shop. So he said, yeah, I'm up for it. So he come with us. And it's funny because when we got to Buenos Aires, what I didn't realise when we got there was that Stone Roses are huge. And you know, Argentina's not that big on. They're not bothered about hip hop down there. They love rock and roll. They love British rock and roll. They love Manchester rock and roll especially. You know, they love the Roses, they love the Mondays, they love Oasis, they love New Order. They love, you know, they love all that stuff. So by the time we got to, and I'll tell you a little story about this, because Mikey threw his hand in for this. We were flapping a little bit because we convinced Adidas to pay for the flights and get the cameraman and get the photographer. Yeah. What if we get down there and then blue boxes are full of ice skates and rugby boots? We didn't know what was going to be there. So we were like, you know what, we have to come back with a film, whatever. So we had 2 holdalls full of vintage shit.
Just in case.
Just in case, because it's like, if we get there, and we've spent a lot of money on these flights to get to Argentina, and all that, like, we need to come back with a film, whatever. Anyway, when we finally got to the shop and we saw what was in there, we were like, we better put them vintage shoes back in the van. We're not going to need them. You know what I mean? So it was So when we came back, it did make me laugh a lot because people, you know, you had the, you know, the know-all kind of experts who were sort of spouting off about, you know, oh, it was all a marketing scam, it was all a hoax and all. And like Mike Shakuti said, he said, you know, I wish it was a marketing scam, because if that was a hoax, we'd be the greatest marketeers on the planet.
Totally.
To be able to set up a shop that looks that authentic on the other side of the world, do you know what I mean? And the thing I loved about that whole thing was, you know, when we first met Carlos, he's a pretty hard-faced guy, and what he did, he'd had someone come down there who wanted to make a movie about Maradona. And what they'd done was they'd gone in his shop and they'd gone, oh, this is perfect, we want to use it. So he stood there kind of like, you know, weighing them up. And then the guy said, what will it cost us to rent your shop for a few days to shoot the film? And Carlos goes, what, you think you can buy me? You can buy me? Get out my shop. Threw him out the shop. I don't care about your film. I don't care, he's a legend. Get out my shop. Threw him out the shop. So we were warned when we arrived there that we didn't know how it was going to go with him. And it was only when he saw the first Special exhibition and we told him that we'd given all the money from that to the Teenage Cancer Trust.
Yeah.
He realised that we were legit and that we weren't just mercenaries going there to try and buy up his stock to sell on. And that, you know, and that those products were going to have a second life, you know. And so he was really hard-faced when we first met him. And we were like, don't tell him that Ian's a musician. Don't mention any of that. And the funny thing was, so we didn't do, because we didn't want to rock the boat. But then we went to have a bit of dinner with him in his local cafe.
Yeah.
And we walk in there and the waitress is a Stone Roses fan and he's going, Ian Brown, and puts the music on, and Carlos is like, what's this? And then he starts smiling because he's like, oh, I'm sat with a rock star here, do you know what I mean? And it was funny, but it was what was beautiful about that was seeing the haters and the cynicism that came about on, you know, some of the comments online about, oh, typical gang of Northerners gone down to Argentina and robbed an old man of his trainers and all that. But to go back there and make that second film,
yeah,
and see how it had transformed that guy's life, but not only transformed his life, transformed his community, because that area where he is, you know, it's not one of the kind of well-off parts of Buenos Aires, you know what I mean? And now he's gone from this kind of slightly cranky old guy who's sitting in his shop with kind of cobwebs all over the shoe boxes, not wanting to sell anything, to sort of like a
totally
local hero, really. Who's been.
What was the first thing he said when he saw his face on the shoe?
Oh, he was just. It was, you know, it's things like that that make the old game worthwhile. Really.
Totally.
It's you know, it was like, you know, you can affect and change things. You know what I mean? Moments like that are priceless. Just in the same way that, you know, seeing Jan from Night Safe in Blackburn, you know, to work with a local charity in Blackburn. You know, Blackburn's got the highest child-to-parent ratio in the country. There's a lot of young people on the streets, and what's happening right now, you know, we're all talking. You know, like I said, my missus is frontline NHS, but you know, it's not just, you know, the NHS that's under pressure. All kinds of charities are under pressure right now. You know, I spoke to Jan from Night Safe last week, and you know, they rely on overseas volunteers. You know, a lot of them overseas volunteers have had to leave, so they've had to close some of the places down. And you know, it's tough times out there right now. You know,
yeah, of course.
If you can use your position to do something that just in some way affects people's lives and puts a little bit of something back in, you know, all for the better, really.
Totally. I think we can probably go on for hours. We'll have a couple more, and then I think we'll have to leave everyone to the evening. I think. Where should we finish up? I mean, we've got loads of things we can talk about. Obviously, that one thing that I guess don't get much airtime, but I think we're both big fans of is leisure shoes in general from the brand.
Yeah.
So I think obviously we've done a few references. There's plenty of stuff that you've done in the past and even more recently in terms of that. Why do you think that that's just not almost been a bigger thing? Like, but then all of a sudden one will come out, whether it be Garwin or Punstock or anything come through, and then.
Well, it's funny this, because as we're talking, there's someone just put a thing up saying LG, LG, LG. I know that Liam's watching this because he's been sending me text messages while this has been going on. Yeah, but them lot were, Oasis were always on my case when I first started working with them about how do we get hold of Adidas leisure shoes.
Yeah.
And anybody that comes from that era, kind of in the Northwest, will remember those shoes. And, you know, when I first joined Adidas, I used to badger the product managers and say, you know, when are you lot going to kind of, when are you lot going to bring back the old leisure shoes? And what was interesting was I got tipped off about some dead stock in Scandinavia. And I went up to Scandinavia, me and Mike Shakusi went over there, and we found a bunch of dead stock Adidas stuff, and there was some of the old leisure shoes in there. There was some Corsicas in there. Unfortunately, I didn't have Liam's size, but I did have his brother's size, Noel. And we went up to, I went up to Wheeler End, and it was when they were recording that album that's got In Due Times on it. Oh, I can't even think straight right now. But they were recording that album anyway, and I went up there, and I had a pair in Noel's size, and it was the first time any of us had seen them for years. Obviously, I had shoes for Liam as well, and it was that, but they just weren't quite how I remembered them. Do you know what I mean? I remembered them looking really chunky, and when I got these, I was like, oh no. And it's interesting with the passage of time, some things, you know, they date well and other things don't date so well. So what I wanted to do with Spezial was reintroduce this idea of leisure shoes, but to do something that was like a contemporary take on them. Because some of them, you know, some of the original leisure shoes, they look a bit kind of like a bit Roger Moore or something. Do you know what I mean? They're just not quite there. They don't quite lend themselves. And you always get the purists who will say, you know, well, you know, do the original Palermo, do the original Corsica, but then you kind of go, yeah, but, you know, those purists make up such a small audience. And every time I do a leisure shoe, there's people either love them or people just annihilate them. Do you know what I mean? And I kind of, you know, I've got broad shoulders. I don't mind that, because the beauty of what we do with Spezial is just like in the 80s where we wore tennis shoes and we wore running shoes and we wore Ikers and we wore leisure shoes and we wore flat suede stuff. It's like I try to go on all them different kind of touch points. You know, we liked outdoor shoes, we liked indoor shoes, rather than kind of turning into a monoculture that's just a one-dimensional thing, which is purely flat suede gum. Do you know what I mean? And I know there's people who only love flat suede gum, and if that's your thing, I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying, but it's like, so people will say, you know, oh, like, I like this shoe and I like that shoe. I don't like all the Spezial shoes. And I kind of go, well, it's not aimed for you to like every
no, and I think
but
the education's good as well. A lot of things that people learn from it, like you just wouldn't know unless you didn't. And like you said, it's not to be one dimensional, but you actually learn from it. If you see a Corsica for the first time, or you see Gawain and you see what you referenced or what points have been taken from, and I think as an authority, all you're doing is showing people, informing people, and again that goes back to community. You're learning from it, and you're like-minded individuals, I guess, educating and sharing stories. So it all comes back to community stories and the sharing, and ultimately that's what makes it special.
Yeah, and also you've got to be thinking about moving things forward as well. You know, Adidas, the thing with Spezial is they don't need me to tell them that Adidas Stockholms are popular.
Yeah.
You know, people will message me and go, when are you going to do a Stockholm for Spezial? And I go, well, they don't need me for that. They know that themselves. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's just about trying to find things that are slightly off the beaten track that can take things in slightly new directions. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
Like, you know, like if you look at the midsole of the new shoe that's coming out, the Zero, you know, that's from like a very lesser known version of a Montreal, which is better known now because of, you know, Neil Selvey and his crew did that book recently, you know, the past to present book.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a pair of them in there, so they're better known now. But you know, that was a very kind of, you know, one of those kind of left field shoes, one of those randoms, you know. And it's kind of, for me, you know, like I say, I come from that generation where it's kind of, you know, you root around in factory outlets or whatever, trying to find that random shoe that was made for a specialist sport that, you know, that nobody knew about. You know, the very name Spezial comes from handball Spezial, which is the essence of what it's all about. You know, the handball, I don't know anybody from the Blackburn, Darwin area that plays handball. I'm sure there's probably is one somewhere.
Yeah, a local
Nobody
club.
I knew, but when handball specials landed in Gibson Sports in Blackburn in the mid-80s, like everybody had to have a pair. You know, I remember it was handball specials and universals, and they both had those gum soles on them, and they landed at the same time, and everybody went mad about them. And it's this idea of, you know, a shoe that was made for a random specialist sport that none of us played, that we all adopted because we were, you know, that was, you know, they were the shoes you wore. That was part of the identity. That was part of the thing, you know, whatever that thing is.
Yeah, totally. But it's that thing that keeps us all there. It keeps us all talking. It keeps us all. Yeah, it goes back to community. I think it goes back to stories. I think should we leave it there? I think we could probably go on all night, couldn't we? We've had loads of stuff.
I certainly can. It's my favourite topic.
I know. Well, we'll have to do it again. We've had loads of stuff come through, so I don't know if we've covered everything, but we'll try and get something else planned in.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks everybody that's tuned in and everybody that's been respectful. I'd love to have been answering the questions that are coming up, but I'm kind of, I'm trying to think about two things at once, and I've had text messages popping in as well. Do you know what I mean? From some of my old pals. But yeah, thanks for asking me to do it. I've enjoyed it. I hope other people have. And yeah, it's not always as simple as it seems when you're on the outside looking in. You know what I mean? And please forgive me for those blue marks.
Right. Stay safe, Gary. I hope everyone's okay, and then we'll speak soon. Thanks for coming on.
God bless.
See you later. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Cheers.